A sea of people take over Washington and cities across the United States marching for their lives. They rallied united in a call to end gun violence. Good evening. They came by the hundreds of thousands of student-led movement in major cities across the U.S. and around the world.
Together, they demanded more gun control, sparked by a deadly Florida shooting last month. Today, young survivors spoke out. These were echoed by demonstrations here in Toronto. Today, people impacted by gun violence spoke out at a rally that started at City Hall and ended at Queen's Park. We're going to have more from the local event in just a moment, but first to CTV's Joy Malbin, who begins our coverage from Washington.
Eagles for Eagles! MSD strong!
Students arrive from across America, parents and activists all descending on Washington, packing the streets right up to the Capitol, delivering one simple message: enough is enough.
To send a message to the politicians that we're not going to stay silent.
Their voices loud and clear, led to action by survivors of last month's Parkland, Florida shooting. Emma Gonzalez, a high school senior, remembers.
6 minutes and 20 seconds with an AR-15, and my friend Carmen would never complain to me about piano practice.
The crowd chanting "never again" and with tears in her eyes.
Fight for your lives before it's someone else's job.
In a country where there are more guns than people, this younger generation is demanding change. It's why Kat Shamel, a dual citizen, and her dad, Chuck, a member of the NRA, traveled from Canada to be here.
The kid who had that gun had a long history of violence and abuse, and it's completely unacceptable that he was able to get his hands on a gun, much less an assault rifle.
The students here say that if the gun laws don't change, they'll change the politicians. They may not be able to vote now, but they soon will be.
They know that if there is no tightening of the background checks, we will vote them out.
From Toronto, New York to California, calls for gun reform, with plenty of celebrity help, like Jennifer Hudson, who lost family to gun violence. Never again, a powerful message they hope is part of a new national movement for change. Joy Malbin, CTV News, Washington.
CTV's Miranda Anthony next. Miranda, you were at the Solidarity demonstration here in Toronto.
That's right, Andrea. It was a huge crowd marching in solidarity with the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. The main message today: it is time for change, not just in the U.S., but also here in Canada. And they will not be quiet until it happens.
If we open an ear, listen, not judge, it could still be here. It starts with us.
The impact and toll gun violence takes on a community was heard and felt today in Toronto as thousands gathered to call for an end to it.
We're going to embarrass them. We're going to shame the government into doing the right thing.
The March for Our Lives was born out of the senseless shooting deaths of 17 students and staff last month at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida.
Carmen Centrup, 16.
Nicholas DeWert, 17.
Today, their names were read one by one in front of the U.S. consulate by two of their surviving classmates who marched alongside Torontonians.
We want change, and we want it now.
This student, who wanted to be anonymous, lost her friend in the shooting.
We went to every hospital in the region trying to see if maybe we could find her body. And when I called Carmen's parents, I'm never going to forget the sound of their voice that said, "I just want to know where my little girl is."
I want politics to stop looking at us as statistics and instead as children and people with families, that people, we had people we loved that loved us.
My dad was a good guy, but one time when he went to work, he got killed by a gun. So I remember him sometimes, so I don't really cry about him.
It's just left us heartbroken, and like, why does this even have to happen? Why is this even an issue?
This crowd is calling for better background checks and tighter gun control laws. But at this gun show in Ajax, some say it's not that simple, and the new gun legislation in Canada is misdirected.
They always come back to licensed gun owners, which are precisely not the people that are causing the violence, and they're not the people that if you further regulate, that you're going to see any difference in gun violence. But we're just a very convenient group.
Rod Giltaca is the founder of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights.
Let's find out who's shooting, who's doing the shooting, who's doing the violence. And if they happen to be unlicensed individuals, then you know what that problem is, and then you create measures to solve that problem. You don't just say, I don't know, whoever's got a gun, licensed, unlicensed, shooting people, not, whatever, everybody pays.
But these demonstrators say when safety is compromised, everyone does pay, especially those who've experienced gun violence.
Know you're not alone. Know that we stand with you and we're going to make change so no one has to go through the grief you're going through right now, and this never has to happen again.
Change from the march is already starting to happen. At the end of it, a table was set up with a petition calling on better policies to be put in place, starting from the ground up. The organizer says it will be taken to their local MP fresh with hundreds of new signatures. Reporting live, I'm Miranda Anthesel. Colin.
Thank you, Miranda. Toronto wasn't the only city showing solidarity on this side of the border. There were marches in other parts of Canada, too, and around the world. Students hit the streets of Montreal today, joining the global call for changes to gun laws. One of the speakers at this event was a former student of Stoneman Douglas High School. In Ottawa, a rally started on Parliament Hill, and then several hundred people marched to a park outside the U.S. Embassy, where a prayer and a moment of silence was held. And demonstrators at the March for Our Lives in Paris say it is important for Americans overseas to lend their voices to the cause. The march in France comes just a day after a deadly extremist attack left 4 people dead. The Paris rally is just one of hundreds across Europe, including in Amsterdam and Brussels. Let's go back to where this all began in Washington. CTV's Joy Malbin is there live now. Joy, students are obviously hoping the collective voices around the world will have an impact. The midterm elections coming up in November of this year. How much of a difference could this actually make?
It's tough not to be cynical when you've covered mass shootings like Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook, where all those first graders were killed. But it felt different at this movement today. This is a younger generation, and they're simply saying, we've had enough. And you know what? We may not be able to vote now, but we soon will be. They were signing up people for voter registration. The midterms are coming up in November. Like you said, they're signing petitions. They're planning walkouts. They're planning more marches, and they also have a power. They have the power of social media. They have reached out to students and parents and adults. We spoke to Canadians. About 100 of them came down for this march. So the message is getting out there. They are shaming the politicians and the politicians who take money from the National Rifle Association and saying, look, we want some changes. They've already changed some gun laws in Florida. Is this a movement? It sure looked like one today.
And what is this movement eventually working towards, Joy? Are they looking for a total and complete gun ban in the United States, which obviously would be very difficult to achieve, or are they looking for further restrictions?
They're looking for limitations. They're looking for what people here call common sense gun rules, raising the age limit. Look, if you have to vote when you're 18 or 21 in some states here, that should, raise the age limit to buy a gun. They want a ban on assault weapons. What do you need an assault weapon for? You can't use it for hunting. You'd blow away the deer. I mean, they've got a few limitations what they want to do, and they want tighter gun restrictions, universal background checks, things that you would expect. But for some reason, there is just gridlock in this city, and politicians are reluctant because they don't want to go against the gun lobby.
All right, CTV's Joy Malbin in Washington. Thank you.
Tonight on City News, marching for lives.
Our friends were murdered in front of us, and our innocence has been taken.
Torontonians join a global demonstration calling for an end to gun violence, why they want elected officials here in Canada to hear their voices too.
When they had the shootings down in the States, I looked at those mothers and I saw myself.
tears and a powerful message. Student survivors of the Florida high school shooting leading the charge for gun control today at massive March for Our Lives rallies across the U.S. Why they say their movement does not end when they go home tonight. Instead, it's only getting started.
Welcome to the revolution.
Unified demonstrations taking place globally. The March for Our Lives rally saw hundreds of thousands across the U.S. and Canada demanding stronger gun control laws, sparked by deadly mass shootings down south, most recently in February, where 17 students and faculty members were killed at a school in Parkland, Florida. Today's message was clear.
We want safety.
In the crowd of these demonstrators here in Toronto are family members who lost loved ones to gun violence in Canada, and they're sending a message to elected officials.
My dad was a good guy, but one time when he went to work, he got killed by a gun.
At just 7 years old, Terrence has already been impacted by gun violence. His father, Kissinger Gunn, only 26 years old, was shot and killed back in 2016.
So I remember him so he can remember me.
Photos of Kissinger, Justin Bachma, and Gabriel Nikov held in the crowd at Queen's Park. They are just some of the victims of gun violence shot and killed here in Toronto. Their families have been advocating to get guns off the streets, for government to fund more money into diverting these crimes and enhancing security at the border to stop these weapons from getting into Canada.
We don't want that. We don't want people dying for no reason. People shouldn't be walking around with guns. It's got to stop.
The fact is there has been no changes. There could have been something that occurred before my son was murdered.
The U.S.-led demonstration also saw advocates calling on Toronto to respond to what many say is a growing gun problem.
My son could have been alive today if there was stricter gun laws.
3 months into 2018, the city has already seen 69 shootings. That's according to recent data from Toronto Police. The previous year saw 392 shootings, and in 2016, there were 407. Mayor John Tory saying yesterday he's continuing the push to crack down on international and domestic gun trafficking.
When they had the shootings down in the States, I looked at those mothers and I saw myself, and it's too hard. It's just too hard.
My friend was shot 4 times. Our prom dates became pallbearers.
The grief experienced by survivors of the Parkland massacre had a strong presence here north of the border. Carmen Shentrup was amongst the victims who was gunned down just before turning 17. Her friend, a survivor of the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, stood in unison with the crowd in Toronto.
There was chaos, there was fear, there was tears. I heard people calling their parents and telling them goodbye for what they thought was the last time. And I never thought that I'd lose anyone I knew there, but I did. This is a global movement at this point, because this isn't a problem that's just affecting America. It's the whole world, because we want safety for everyone. We want people to feel like, hey, I can go walk out in Toronto and not worry about my life.
A petition will be going to Parliament Hill asking Ottawa to provide funding in support of families who've been impacted by gun violence. In Toronto, I'm Faiza Meek for City News.
Welcome to the revolution.
Watched for years as gun violence continues to take a toll on communities across the country. I would like to not worry about dying.
Let's put the USA over the NRA.
To those people that tell us that teenagers can't do anything, I say that we were the only people that could have made this movement possible.
Massive crowds rallying across the U.S. today, just over 5 weeks since the deadly Florida high school shooting. Now a student-orchestrated movement is saying enough is enough, never again, as they march for their lives.
In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us, 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone, in the Douglas community was forever altered.
I am here today to acknowledge and represent the African American girls whose stories don't make the front page of every national newspaper.
Organizers expected 500,000 people to descend on Washington, D.C. for the largest of today's rallies. Marches also held in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond.
Who here is going to vote in the 2018 election?
And students signaling again and again they're taking their movement to the ballot box.
The pressure is on for every person in power, and it will stay that way. Because they know what is coming. They know that if there is no assault weapons ban passed, then we will vote them out.
In Parkland, among those speaking today, the parents of some of the young victims killed on Valentine's Day at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School.
I would give everything to have one more day, one more hour, one more second with the sweetest boy in the world.
And international support coming from rallies in the UK, France, Germany, and Australia. Donald Trump spending the weekend at his Mar-a-Lago estate, touching down in Florida last night. Today, the White House releasing a statement that reads in part, "We applaud the many courageous young Americans exercising their First Amendment rights today." On Friday, the Department of Justice issued the rule to ban bump stocks, following through on the president's commitment to ban devices that turn legal weapons into illegal machine guns.
Granddaughter of Martin Luther King.
Back to the rally in D.C., where one of the youngest people to take the stage was the granddaughter of Martin Luther King Jr.
My grandfather had a dream that his 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that enough is enough, and that this should be a gun-free world, period.
9-year-old Yolanda Renee King leaving the crowd with this message.
All across the nation, we are going to be a great generation. Now give yourselves a hand.
Tonight, banding together in the March for Their Lives. From Washington, D.C. to Parkland, Florida, and around the world, young people mobilize for tougher gun control laws. Plus, marching in solidarity.
If we are old enough to be shot at, we are old enough to have a voice.
Toronto joins forces with those south of the border in a bid to end gun violence.
You're watching Global Toronto. This is Global News at 6.
Their message was loud and clear. Tens of thousands of students marched on Washington demanding gun control. This, of course, is in the wake of last month's deadly shooting at a high school in Parkland, Florida that killed 17 people. Good evening and thank you for joining us. Angie is away tonight. I'm Mina Ree. It was that February 14th massacre that prompted student survivors to summon people from across the U.S. and here in Canada to unite for the March for Our Lives. Jackson Prosco begins our coverage from the U.S. Capitol, where political activism has been ignited among the young.
The rallies took place in cities across the United States and around the world, but it was here in Washington where the movement really came home. People traveled here to send a message to politicians as they called for real and effective changes to America's gun laws. The message we heard from the crowd today is that people are upset with the lack of action, they're tired of the influence of the NRA, and they're wondering what it's going to take to stop another mass shooting from happening. It was the students from Parkland, Florida who started this whole movement after a school shooting there left 17 people dead last month. Today, their voices were the loudest in the crowd of tens of thousands who gathered here.
Kids need to be safe, and enough is enough school violence. This will be the last school shooting in the USA.
Organizers are hoping to turn that frustration and passion into real political change.
Since the time that I came out here, it has been 6 minutes and 20 seconds. The shooter has ceased shooting and will soon abandon his rifle, blend in with the students as they escape, and walk free for an hour before arrest. Fight for your lives before it's someone else's job.
Many of the students here are right on the cusp of being old enough to vote, and there was a real push today to make sure they're registered and ready so that they can put their words into action. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Here at home, there was solidarity for those marching south of the border. While some GTA students made the trip to Washington, those who couldn't marched through Toronto streets. And Erica Vella was there.
If we are old enough to be shot at, we are old enough to have a voice.
Her words powerful, poignant, and they come just 6 weeks after a man opened fire in her own school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida.
My friend was shot 4 times. Our prom dates became pallbearers. Our friends were murdered in front of us, and our innocence has been taken.
17 people, her peers, killed.
There was chaos, there was fear, there was tears. I heard people calling their parents and telling them goodbye for what they thought was the last time.
And on Saturday, she came to Toronto to speak on behalf of those parents who lost their children and her peers who lost friends, to share a message that is being shared across North America.
But I'm not here to take away all of your guns, but these assault rifles, do not belong on the streets of the everyday world. They do not belong in my high school.
I knew I had to do something. I knew I had to use my voice, so that's why I'm here today.
She's just one of hundreds marching to stop gun violence.
No justice, no peace, until the guns are off the street.
I work with young people every day in a school and how they've been affected by gun violence daily, and it really it hits close to home.
Among the group, this mother who says gun violence isn't only a problem in the U.S.
The fact is, in the past 3 years, the gun violence has escalated, and nobody, not one single person in power, has acknowledged this issue.
Her son, Kissinger Gunn, was shot and killed in Toronto in 2016. And 2 years later, the family still coping with the pain.
And it makes you sad, and you're just like, wow, this is my life, this is reality, and this is what I have to deal with for the rest of my life.
My heart hurts for everyone that's goes through it, because I know what it feels like.
The family, as well as hundreds of others, have come back to speak out.
At the school that I go to, we've lost a lot of lives to gun violence. There needs to be a pushback. I think anytime you want change, there has to be some kind of resistance.
To mobilize lawmakers in Canada and the U.S. to make changes that will create a safe world for future generations. Erica Vella, Global News.
This is CBC Saturday News.
The spark lit by angry, grieving students in Parkland, Florida, spread across America today. 500,000 people gathered in Washington to demand tougher gun control, and tens of thousands marched in protests in 800 American cities. As Stephen D'Souza tells us, it was an extraordinary display of political will not seen in a generation.
In Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania Avenue was a sea of faces hoping to lead a tidal wave of change.
To the leaders, skeptics, and cynics who told us to sit down and stay silent, wait your turn. Welcome to the revolution.
If you do not stand with us by saying we need to pass common sense gun legislation, you have chosen death, and none of the millions of people marching in this country today will stop.
Emma Gonzalez, one of the faces of the student movement, stood in silence for more than 6 minutes, the exact amount of time it took a gunman to kill 17 people at her school last month. The passion of the students from Parkland, Florida, has spread like wildfire across the country. Rallies took place from coast to coast, even in gun-friendly states like Texas. And across continents, in Paris, Berlin, as far away as Sydney, Australia. In all, there were more than 800 rallies today. Numerous celebrities also joined the cause, performing and marching, sometimes for very personal reasons.
One of my best friends was killed in gun violence right around here, so it's important to me.
In New York, people came from neighborhoods where their calls for gun control have been ignored.
But it's actually good for them to finally be taking a stand right now. Hopefully our voices will be heard.
Parkland students say they do hear them.
We share the stage today and forever with those who have always stared down the barrel of a gun.
Even Martin Luther King's 9-year-old granddaughter lent her voice.
I have a dream that enough is enough. And that this should be a gun-free world, period.
And while the White House today touted progress it's made on background checks and bump stocks, the students aren't satisfied.
We are not here for breadcrumbs. We are here for real change. We are here to lead.
A message they say they'll push to the ballot box in midterm elections in November and beyond. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
And it wasn't just Americans marching today against gun violence. Right here in Canada, rallies were held coast to coast from Victoria to St. John's. Canada may have stricter gun laws, but we are not immune to the issue of gun deaths. Natalie Nanowski has more.
I had just turned 16 years old February 1st. 2 weeks later, I witnessed the death of my friends, classmates, and teachers.
Henry Dryden is a student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the site of that deadly shooting last month. He says since that event, the atmosphere at school has changed.
We've come together as a huge community after this. There's no cliques at Douglas. There's no separation. We're all here for each other.
That's why it's important for him and classmate Sarah Imam to make sure their friends feel their support. Both of them are in Toronto for spring break and unable to protest with their classmates in Washington.
It brings tears to my eyes, honestly, seeing the people cheering, clapping, supporting us, supporting our cause, for our safety, for our futures. It's an amazing movement to see, even all the way out here in Toronto.
And not only Toronto, but young and old took to the streets across the country toting signs of peace. In Ottawa, marchers stopped at the foot of Parliament Hill, and in Montreal, they walked through the downtown core.
Their friends are gone. I want them to feel that they can do stuff, that they can help those people. I want them to feel that they can make a difference.
And the students from Parkland, Florida have created what's arguably the largest anti-gun movement the U.S. has ever seen, with more than 800 cities all over the globe joining in, spreading one message.
It's our time to stand up and be like, no, stop with the BS. This, enough is enough. It's not fair for us to wake up in the morning being like, what if something happens to one of our friends?
The hope is that by standing in solidarity with the students from the Parkland shooting, that it sends a very strong message to the U.S. government that enough is enough. Natalie Nanowski, CBC News, Toronto.